Hello, and welcome to the second installment of Intellectual Conversations with Jason Sylvester. And I am your host, Jason Sylvester, and this is my channel. Joining me today is Greg Dawes, Professor Greg Dawes, who's had an interesting life. He was a Catholic priest in his younger days, and he's a professor of religion and philosophy. And he's here today to talk about a new book he's working on that specifically looks at science. And Greg, he's already written a couple of books. I've got the names here. He's written a couple of books on the intersection of religion and science. So one is Deprovincializing Science and Religion, and a second book, Galileo and the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Um, and so this is sort of one of Greg's little hobbies that he likes to look at how science and religion interact. So he's got a new book he's working on that he's here to talk to us about is science Western? So Greg, thank you for joining us. So maybe we can give our readers just a quick intro into your thinking on the science, whether it's Western or global.
Right. Well, I became interested in this question partly because of debates in New Zealand at the present time. There are debates about, well, New Zealand is, of course, was originally a British colony. The British arrived here in the late 18th, early 19th century and made Captain James Cook was one of the early British people to make some claim to New Zealand. But of course, New Zealand had an indigenous people, the Maori people, who have been here since about the 14th century. They'd sailed from the Eastern Pacific, extraordinary achievement in itself, sailing from the Eastern Pacific down to New Zealand. And so I've been here for about 700 years or so before Europeans arrived. And of course, like any country that has been colonized by Europeans, we now have a movement of, it's sometimes called decolonization, or an attempt to try and grapple with our own history. What has it meant for the indigenous people that they've lived for the last 200 years under the influence of Europeans who quickly became a dominant force? I mean, we had wars here in New Zealand. We had land wars over land between some Maori people and the British in the 19th century. So it's a very difficult history. And as part of that, though, people have been interested in, well, are there indigenous ways of knowing which are different from those which we're familiar with in the West? And in particular, are there indigenous ways of knowing which differ from, well, people keep calling it Western science. So my thought was, well, people keep talking about Western science, but in what sense is what we call science Western? After all, it's practiced now all over the world. When the Chinese epidemiologists and virologists discovered the coronavirus, they were using exactly the same sort of scientific techniques as people in the United States. In fact, actually, notoriously, some American and Chinese researchers had been working together in Wuhan on coronaviruses. But in any case, science has now become international. So in what sense can we think of it as a Western thing, differing from ways of knowing in other cultures? So that's the question I got interested in.
Yeah, so it's definitely an intriguing proposition. So, like as you mentioned, that the Maoris, they were able to navigate the seas without the
Right.
benefit of Western science. You have the ancient Sumerians with their astronomy, the Egyptians. Um, the one example I was thinking of was that I think it was the Babylonians who were the first to divide the clock into 60 because
Yep. Yep.
60 is the only number that can be divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and that's why the
Right.
Babylonians use 60. So obviously there's plenty of examples from antiquity of pre-Western science, like even going back before the Babylonians, back into the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. You've got these big stone monoliths that are marking the solstice so that they know when to plant their crops. So obviously there's evidence of science before the Western scientific revolution that was ushered in, at the end of the Renaissance.
Well, there's certainly evidence of a great deal of sophisticated empirical knowledge, which was very powerful. And as you say, the Babylonians had extraordinary quantity of astronomical observations, which actually the Greeks inherited. So if you read, for example, if you read Ptolemy, the great 2nd century AD astronomer, whose astronomy was the dominant way of viewing astronomy right up until the time of Copernicus. In fact, Ptolemy actually cites quite explicitly Babylonian observations. He's using these as data in the 2nd century AD for working out his own astronomy. So the Greeks were well aware of their debt to, say, the Egyptians and the Babylonians, as they themselves were developing what we think of as some of the earliest forms of science. So there is the sense in which, if you think of the sort of precursors of modern science as developing in places like Greece and Alexandria in particular during the Hellenistic period, then actually it had always been a fairly international affair. People were drawing ideas from all over the place, including the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And of course, Alexandria is a city in Egypt. So even though people were writing in Greek, were perhaps of Greek ancestry, they were in touch with local traditions of knowledge. So a first kind of historical observation is that actually what we call science has always been a kind of international affair, if you like. People from all over the place were doing it, and their data was being employed by others. So I think that's a really important point. So is there something then distinctive about modern science? That's one of the questions. Is it, many cultures have these traditions of empirical knowledge gained from observation. And, the Polynesian navigational techniques were quite extraordinary. The ability to know the paths that stars traveled as they rose and traveled across the sky, and to follow those star paths, or to know about the paths of migrating birds so that you could follow the paths of a migrating bird to find an island, or to know about the temperature of the sea at different points, or the ways in which waves reflect off islands. So from the patterns of waves, you could tell that an island was close. This is an extraordinary degree of highly tuned empirical knowledge. But one of the tricky questions is it identical with what we call science, or is it what you might call a kind of proto-science, a kind of early form of empirical knowledge from which what we think of as science developed? So that's one of the questions here is, given these bodies of empirical knowledge, is there something different about what we call science?
Okay. You mentioned, so I was in your draft of the book you're working on, you mentioned, let me quote it here, at its operational level, the set of practices we call modern science is not exclusively Western. If modern science has Western elements, I shall argue these are to be found at its theoretical and meta-theoretical rather than at its operational level. So the operational levels, that's what we're referring to, this empirical observation that we see in cultures all around the world from antiquity. It's the modern scientific revolution that has bequeathed to the world this theoretical and meta-theoretical sort of approach.
Yeah. I think one of the problems here is that we tend to think of science, we talk about science as though it's one thing. Now, obviously, it's not one thing because there are many sciences. So theoretical physics is very different from evolutionary biology. Or, if sociology is a science, then it's a very different sort of science from biology or theoretical physics. So you've got a whole range of sciences for a start. But also within each science, I think you can think of different levels or dimensions of scientific practice. There's what I'm calling the operational level, which is the level at which people make observations, conduct experiments, do measurements. At that level, I'm arguing, people use techniques, or at least refined versions of techniques, which all cultures employ. It's at this level that you find those sort of commonalities that you were referring to earlier. Like the Babylonians did very careful observations of stars and some kinds of measurements of the positions of stars and planets at different times. And there's this sort of observation-based reasoning, careful measurement. These are practices that all cultures engage in. And all that, at that level, all that the modern sciences do is make those practices a bit more sophisticated, a bit more self-conscious, a bit more reliable. But there's nothing uniquely Western about these practices. They're what everyone does. In the course of gathering what I'm calling everyday practical knowledge. So if you want to track an animal, for example, if you're in a hunter-gatherer society and you're tracking an animal, then you're actually employing modes of reasoning and observation, which are remarkably similar to those employed by scientists. You're looking at evidence, you're making inferences to the best explanation of the evidence, you're looking at alternative hypotheses, you're comparing these, often you'll be discussing these with your fellow hunters. And this has been documented by anthropologists working with such societies, that very sophisticated ways of dealing with empirical evidence are found in societies that lack what we think of as a developed scientific tradition. And yet these are things that are shared with scientific practice as well.
So as I mentioned as we started, you tend, your interests at least tend to fall into this intersection between religion and science. So
yes,
from my own research that you helped guide me on, so people who are familiar with my channel may know that I've written a book on the history of the Catholic Church, and Greg has been one of those who's been helping me with suggestions of things to look at. So Greg's book on Galileo was very influential on my section dealing with Galileo and the Church. Greg also encouraged me to look at what I term the scholastic mavericks. So people like Adelard of Bath, Peter Abelard, Roger Bacon, Sigurd of Brabant, William of Ockham. And the impact, and these are religious people working, like Peter Abelard and Roger Bacon were both monks. So is William of Ockham was a monk. I'm not sure. I don't think Sigurd of Brabant was a monk, but definitely William was a Franciscan. I think Roger Bacon was a Franciscan too. I can't remember where Peter Abelard was, but for Roger Bacon, for sure, Adelard of Bath, Roger Bacon, most definitely were very, very keenly influenced by the scholarship of the Islamic Golden Age. So there's this religious link. So you have the Muslim scholarship of astronomy and mathematics that influences these Latin people in the 12th and 13th centuries, who then go. It's Roger Bacon and his tutor Robert Grosseteste, who founds the scientific method, and everybody thinks it's Bacon, but no, it's Grosseteste who did the scientific method. And then Bacon becomes like a pioneering experimental thinker. And then you get up to Galileo, who then he's in trouble with the church for astronomy, and because he's under house arrest, he then shifts back to mechanical observations and sparks the scientific revolution. So there's this intimate overlay between religion and science. So I'm just curious, how are you getting into that in your book as well, or you're just looking more at the actual theoretical and meta-theoretical basis of what they're doing?
I am to some degree, because I'm very interested in what happened in early modern Europe. I mean, I think modern science has some distinctive features which have something to do. I mean, given this common base that modern science shares at the operational level, the practical level, the level of observation and experiment, these are activities that all human beings engage in, sometimes with remarkable degree of success and precision, as in the case of the Babylonians or Polynesian navigators. What modern science, as it developed in the 17th century, I think there are a couple of features it has. One is there's a sort of underlying metaphor of mechanism, of the machine metaphor. Now, this is sometimes overstated and historians are a bit cautious about it. But nonetheless, one of the interesting things, Aristotle's philosophy tended to start with the idea of a living organism. So, and living organisms act for a purpose. They act with goals in mind. And an animal will search out food. The food is the goal of the animal's activity. A flower might direct itself towards the sun, so the sun is the goal of the flower's movement. So Aristotle, who was, I think, above all a biologist, thought of his sort of underlying root metaphor for thinking about the world was that of a living organism. And this was a very powerful metaphor for a very long time. But then in the 17th century, a kind of different root metaphor starts to take hold, which is this idea of a machine, which is working kind of mindlessly and without purpose. So we start moving into the modern age where actually, as lots of people have pointed out, one of the dominant metaphors in early modern science was that of the clockwork. In fact, Johannes Kepler, at one point says quite explicitly, he's trying to understand the universe not as a living organism, but as a machine akin to a clock, because the mechanism of medieval clocks was very elaborate, of course, and caught people's attention. So that was one thing that was new, was this mechanical metaphor. But a mechanical metaphor means a world which is now no longer thought of in terms of purpose, because machines don't operate for a purpose except insofar as this purpose has been imparted by their creator, and so on and so forth. But also another feature of early modern science, I think, is the high degree of skepticism it employs towards tradition. Most societies before the modern European emergence of modern Europe have valued, perhaps rightly, have valued tradition and have tended to think of their core beliefs as perhaps handed down from the gods. So a very distinctive feature of religion is that certain core beliefs are thought of as sacred because they've been divinely revealed or handed down from the gods. But this is true of knowledge in many societies. Certain core practices are thought of as having a kind of divine authority. And of course, in Europe, this was true too. Not only did you have Christian beliefs, which were thought of as divinely revealed, but you had kings, for example, that ruled by divine right. They were anointed by the archbishop when they became king, as King Charles was, indeed, quite recently. And so they ruled by a kind of divine authority. Of course, what happens in early modern Europe is that these traditional authorities become open to question, and we start thinking about organizing our bodies of knowledge without reference to any divine origin. And so this attitude of skepticism towards traditional authority has been, I think, has played a very important role in the development of modern science. Robert Merton, the sociologist, famously thought that one of the core features of the ethos of modern science was a kind of organized skepticism. In principle, at least, everything is up for grabs. Nothing is sacred. And this immediately makes for a contrast between the world of science and the world of religion, where lots of things are sacred. So one of my interests is, how did this develop? What was it about early modern Europe which gave rise to this deeply skeptical spirit towards authority, without which the kind of radical revolutions that occurred with the rise of modern science are probably inconceivable?
That was one of the points I took from your book on Galileo and the
Yeah,
church, was you had mentioned there were two two preliminary steps that needed to happen, and one was the attitude towards questioning authority that Adelard of Bath and Peter Abelard
yeah,
shattered, and the second was the rebirth of an interest in the natural world. And actual explanations and not just God did it. So yeah, it was that for me was a very interesting section to write. So I'm actually indebted to you for encouraging me to do it, because I learned so much writing that section. Like William of Ockham was, like, everybody knows Occam's razor, but William of Ockham, he was foundational in semantics and logic. He
Yeah.
wrote, in his last years, he wrote almost exclusively against the power of the church, and had actually been excommunicated by the Pope for daring to leave Avignon without permission. So, I mean, he's such an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Most everything people know about him is the razor. I'm like, there's so much more to this guy that's way
Well,
more interesting than Occam's razor.
I'm very pleased I put you in the direction of these late medievals, because I'm looking forward to reading your book. But yeah, actually, I've for a long time been worried about the fact that when people think about the history of philosophy, they tend to go from, maybe Aristotle, if you're lucky, straight to Descartes, as though nothing happened in the intervening 1,000 years or so. But actually, quite a lot happened in the intervening period. In fact, more than 1,500 years almost. So the medievals, I think, are very important. One of the things that did happen in the 14th century or 13th century in particular was the development of universities. And I think universities were important because universities, which modeled themselves on the guilds of tradesmen, had a degree of independence vis-a-vis the surrounding society. It was only a degree of independence, of course. I mean, famously, the Archbishop of Paris tried to forbid the teaching of Aristotle's philosophy in Paris, but he failed, actually, pretty
Well,
quickly.
there were something like three bands, like over a period of like
Yeah,
75 years. There were something like
yeah,
three different bands. So,
yeah,
and
but
in the middle of the band is Thomas Aquinas, who's writing on Aristotle in the
yeah,
middle of all this
exactly.
being banned at the University of Paris. So,
So,
uh,
so what was interesting about the universities is they provided a setting in which people could pursue critical thought. Okay, sure, always under the supervision of the church, but to a remarkable degree, they were able uh, to encourage this kind of critical independence of thought that was, I think, crucial for the rise of modern science as well.
yeah, I discussed that in my book. So in 789, Charlemagne issued the Admonitio Generalis, which instructed every cathedral and monastery to open a school to
Right.
train not only priests and monks, but also administrators for the Carolingian Empire. So those were known as the cathedral schools, which then the cathedral schools become the universities by the 13th century. So the early 1200s, like Oxford and University of Paris, get their royal charters in around 1214, 1215, respectively. Um, and I refer to it as the law of unintended consequences, because here
Yes.
Charlemagne,
Yes.
he opens these schools because, one, he wants people to be literate who can administer the empire, but he also wants very highly educated priests who will instill Christianity in the empire. And yet, 400 years later, you get this highly critical spirit of questioning that comes up with Abelard and Abelard and Roger Bacon and so on. So it's really quite funny that he intends the cathedral schools to strengthen Christianity, and ultimately it weakens Christianity. We end up with the secular society, the Western secular societies that we're in today, that are basically a result of the science that has come out of these universities over the last 800 years.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that's
there's a big historical debate about the degree to which the universities have a role in the rise of modern science. Up until quite recently, historians were inclined to think that the universities were a bit, captured by Aristotelian philosophy and were resistant to novelty. More recently, though, actually, particularly the universities of Italy, historians have been pointing out that a lot of quite groundbreaking new thinking was happening, even among the Aristotelians in the 15th, 16th centuries, particularly the
yeah.
16th century in Italian universities. So the universities, I think, are now being regarded as having a more important role in the rise of modern science than had been until quite recently popular.
I would say there's very definitely a link there.
Yeah,
Was it like
I think
university, like
so.
especially the University of Bologna was critical for law studies. It was like its law
Yeah,
school was probably its biggest one. Padua, which I believe Galileo was a professor
yeah,
at the University of
it was
Padua.
for the time.
But Bologna, yeah, I mean for sure. I mean it was a huge place. One of
And
the one of the people like, in the battles of Aristotle with the University of Paris and the Bishop of Paris, one of the points that I made was that wasn't happening in Italy. Aristotle was accepted in the universities in Italy. He was not banned like he was in France by the Bishop of Paris, but they were much more focused on law because the Codex, Justinian's Codex, had been rediscovered sometime around the 1200s ish, maybe late
that's right.
1100s. I can't
Yeah,
remember exactly. The other issue, and again, it comes back being tied to this thing of religion, is the the transition from a cathedral school to a university is, and again, correlation is not causation, but the transition from a cathedral school to university is in parallel with the arrival of all the Latin translations of the knowledge of the Islamic Golden Age. That's when universities transform. You mentioned a few minutes ago, you were talking about, like you have like a specialized subject, and again, that comes Dermot McCulloch of Oxford University. He talks about that in his book, The History of Christianity. That the idea of professorships, a degree, all of this comes from the Islamic schools.
yeah, and I think this is a really, really important point, and you're absolutely right, of course, to highlight it, that the influence of the Muslim world um, on the West is enormous. And in Bologna in the 12th century, you get the development of sort of legal studies, as you point out, under Gracian in particular. But you also get the development of legal studies which take the form of the critical study of legal texts. So the famous work of Abelard's Sic et Non, Yes and No, where he contrasts conflicting texts from the church fathers, sets them alongside each other to force the reader to think, because they can't both be true. This was a method which had already been employed by the legal scholars in Bologna in dealing with canons. But actually, it does seem to have its roots in the Muslim world as well. So
Yeah,
the Muslim scholarship, both the method of study, but of course also many of the discoveries of Muslim scholars, particularly in optics and astronomy. Probably optics, the study of light and vision, and astronomy were two areas in which Muslim scholars had done an enormous amount, and Western scholars like Grosseteste and Roger Bacon were very dependent on their work. And so once again, in what sense is this science, if this is where modern science begins, or it takes a step forward, is this Western? Well, a lot of the scholars doing it are Muslim. Are Muslims, are people of Persia Westerners? It does seem a bit silly. A lot of these people are
yeah,
Persian astronomers. So this idea that science is sort of narrowly European is a bit ethnocentric in itself.
yeah. I mean,
Because you've got
I can understand like the rigorous of the scientific methodology. I can understand how that is seen as Western, but science itself, yeah. I mean, like if the Western scientific methodology has now been expanded around the globe, there's that. But yeah, science itself. But I think it's the methodology that's Western. Would you agree with that,
well,
or that could be Islamic as well? Because Grosseteste and Bacon are taking optics from the Muslims, and it's really funny because Bacon, like he wrote so glowingly of Avicenna and other
yeah,
Islamic scholars, and he shreds like the Catholic Church and like the myopicness, the myopia of the Catholic Church, and like it's people like Thomas Aquinas and all of their rationalizations.
yeah. But I think actually even the experimental method, although of course it's picked up and developed in the 17th century in Europe in a way which it hasn't been developed elsewhere. Nonetheless, if you look at some of the work in optics done by Ibn Haytham, the Muslim scholar, upon people like Roger Bacon are dependent, the work on optics in the Muslim world did involve experimentation. So experiment was already being developed. I mean, it had been developed to some degree by Hellenistic Greek scholars as well. Working in the field of mechanics, there is a tradition of experimentation. You find a tradition of experimentation in medicine with Galen, the 2nd century medical writer. So the practice of experimentation is itself quite old, but it's also true that Muslim writers, particularly in optics, Muslim thinkers seem to have developed it even before it underwent this enormous revival in the 17th century in Europe. So once again, the roots of modern science are very international and very ancient. Yeah. So I think that's really important.
Like even like the Pre-Socratics, Thales of Miletus, like it's said that he was influenced by the Babylonian and Egyptian astronomical techniques to predict a solar eclipse, because he's living in Ionia, which is modern day Turkey, but it's part at the time he's living, it's part of Cyrus the Great's Persian Empire. So there's this transmission of knowledge coming from the Persians into Eastern Greek Empire, into Ionia, where he's picking up these ideas, and he then ignites the whole of Greek philosophy based on the science he's getting from the Persians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians.
Yep. I think one of the problems we have today is that we are so obsessed with nationality and differing cultures and drawing boundaries between the West and what's not the West, that we forget that in the ancient world, actually a lot of these boundaries were relatively, if there were boundaries, they were religious. And in fact, people often managed to cross those as well. So Adelard of Bart, back in the 11th, 12th century, goes off from England to Syria to learn Arabic in order to be able to translate Arabic texts, and then comes back to England saying, you guys, you don't know what you know nothing. The Arabs have done all this extraordinary work. So you get this amazing kind of interchange of ideas amongst people who recognize that despite religious, cultural, linguistic differences, these people were engaged in the same activity of trying to understand the world in a rational way that we are. So I think, this is not a new idea. Lots of people these days are pointing this out, that science, as we know it, has always been quite an international affair, even though it took some decisive steps forward in the 17th century in Europe, undoubtedly.
Yeah, in the nationalities, that was a section I was just editing a couple hours ago, that it was, again, comes back to religion. The printing press and the Bohemian and German Bibles, and then obviously the English Bibles and other languages that are coming out with the printing press following the Reformation. It was the crystallization of that language. So the German that we have today comes from Luther's Bible, because he's sort of merging High and Low German. Jan Hus is, he's taking the Bohemian language, and that becomes, and so it's with these Bibles and with the advent of the printing press, that's when you get this sort of cohesion of a national identity, because now you have text in a language. So you have standardized spelling, standardized grammar and wordings. And this is sort of when national identities start to form around languages in a geographic region. And again, it comes back to the Bible.
But of course, because medievals, of course, had Latin as a common language, and even Galileo writes some of his works in Latin. But I mean, the printing press, I think, is one of the things that did make possible a community. I mean, one of the features of modern science is that it's quite organized socially. You have scientific societies, you have publication, you have peer review, you have groups of people working together on a project. And the printing press was one of the things that made this possible, because if you're working in a world of manuscripts, even though, many thousands of manuscripts were produced in the medieval world, producing a manuscript is still slow, writing it by hand. Once you have the printing press, you have this enormous explosion of knowledge and ability to share knowledge, which had previously been very difficult. So I think the printing press is, but also another feature of early modern science, I think, and this is what intrigues me about what's, on the one hand, you want to say that, look, what scientists do, to some degree, all peoples do, because they need to find out about the world in order to navigate, to plant crops, to survive. On the other hand, and once science as a more organized activity starts to develop in the medieval universities, it's very dependent upon what the Muslim world did. On the other hand, some unique things did seem to happen in the 17th century in Europe. One of them was the spirit of deeply critical spirit towards authority, which already starts to happen in the medieval universities, as you point out. But I think actually what we used to call, before it became unfashionable, the voyages of discovery. Europeans in the 15th century set out, for better or for worse, to discover the rest of the world, and did so with Columbus, 1492, and others who set out. Now, whatever the consequences of this, for good or bad, a huge amount of new knowledge arrived back in Europe in the 16th century. All of a sudden, not only did you find out about plants and animals that you'd never heard of before and natural phenomena, but you also find out about differing cultures who have quite different ways of doing things. I mean, even the discovery of China and India by Westerners, because everyone recognized very quickly that the Chinese and the Indians had enormously sophisticated cultures. But this had kind of a relativizing effect, You could no longer take for granted that your way of doing things was the only possible way. So I think the voyages of discovery had a big kind of, had a certain impact upon Western thought too, sort of shaking up people's ideas, giving a whole lot of new data for scientific research.
Well, it certainly shakes up the concept of a flat Earth if Columbus can and others can well, Columbus didn't circumnavigate, but others after him circumnavigated. But he at least proved you don't sail off the edge of the Earth. So
yes, although of course no one actually thought you would sail off the edge of the Earth. This is a modern conceit. I mean, back in the Ptolemy gives arguments for the Earth being spherical in the 2nd century, but in fact by then it had been well established that the Earth was spherical. No educated medieval person thought the Earth was flat. This is just a modern a way in which we like to imagine ourselves as more enlightened than our predecessors. But yes, anyway, that's another question.
You mentioned the voyages of discovery, but again, that's tied to religion. Because what happens 40 years before Columbus? You have the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, and they choke off the trade routes on the Silk Road, and they're demanding like exorbitant taxation. So the voyages of discovery are to circumnavigate that chokehold in the Middle East around modern day Turkey and Syria, and to go around Africa. So it's all religion.
Yeah, I mean, once you start looking at the history, the politics and the religion and the science are all inevitably bound up together, for better or for worse.
I don't know if you can see it on your end. Can you, up in the right-hand corner, can you see my logo for my channel?
Yes, I can. Yes, social, political, religious. That's right.
Religious. Makes history.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. That's very true. And that's what makes history so interesting. There are a number of things that happened in Europe which maybe didn't happen in other societies, which kind of shook things up and helped, I think, to make for the kind of significant step forward that the modern sciences took at the time of what we sometimes call the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Although the very phrase scientific revolution has dropped out of favor a bit because people are so aware now of the degree to which it was anticipated by the medievals, by Muslim scholars working in places like Persia. Even some of Copernicus's data and techniques appear to have come from Muslim astronomers working in northwestern Iran. God alone knows how they got to Copernicus, but they appear to have. So, again, ideas travel. So, but nonetheless, something significant does happen in the 17th century in Europe as a result of a number of changes which happen in European society.
You mentioned Galen. This is something I read within the last year or two, but I can't remember where I read it or what the takeaway was. But that Galen was basically, like, as you mentioned, like people like Aristotle and Galen were accepted right up until like the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. They were accepted without question. Like people used Galen's anatomy books. Like nobody bothered to cut into a body, and apparently, like Galen was like flat out wrong. Like he had stuff all over, like in the wrong places. And it wasn't until like the Enlightenment that somebody else thought, maybe I should double check Galen and like, cut open a body and figure out where things really are. So I don't know if you're familiar with that story and who that person was who disproved Galen.
Well, there are a number of people who did. The famous anatomist was Vesalius, who wrote a new book of anatomy, actually published in the same year as Copernicus's work on the solar system, on the shape of the universe. The De Revolutionibus by Copernicus was published in the same year as Vesalius's De Fabrica Humani Corporis, on the structure of the human body. So that's one of the interesting things. About the same time, all these kind of revolutionary developments start to happen. But again, as part of this critical attitude towards authority, it's very interesting that the motto of the Royal Society, founded in about 1660 in England, was nullius in verba in Latin, which means basically take no one's word for it. Check for yourself. And this was something of this new spirit of questioning authority, which becomes so critical for modern science. Yeah.
Actually, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, ironically, from what we know, Galen himself did a lot of first-hand experimentation. He got a lot of things wrong, but actually he did a lot of first-hand dissection and experimentation, sometimes, alas, on living subjects. Yeah. No ethics committee would approve of what Galen did today, but still, he was certainly a first-hand experimenter.
Yeah, you mentioned Copernicus again. You got to come back. It comes back to religion. So we know the Julian calendar had drifted and we were off, which has an impact on obviously planting and harvests. But do you know why the people like Copernicus? It wasn't just him. There was like a whole team of priests and astronomers. Do you remember what the reason was? What they were doing it for?
I don't know in the case of Copernicus, to be honest. I
know because they wanted to calculate the correct date for the spring equinox so they could calculate Easter. So it had nothing to do with science. It was all about when is Easter, because we don't want to get it wrong.
I mean, certainly that had always been an issue for astronomy within the Christian world. Was how to calculate the date of Easter was an issue. I don't recall that being an issue that motivated Copernicus in particular.
Although it may have been what it motivated the church to authorize these priests and astronomers to go out and do these observations.
Yeah. Although actually by the time of Copernicus, 1543, you've actually got, as you yourself were saying earlier, a fair degree of intellectual independence amongst the scholars, that they did a lot of work without feeling they needed to wait for the church's authorization. And so I think that we can overstate the degree to which the church had a sort of a heavy hand on on intellectual activity at this time. Quite a lot
Yeah.
happened, particularly, yeah, as you were saying, in the Italian universities, which was remarkably free of sort of religious authority in some respects.
Yeah.
And of course, uh, when Harvey, we talk about Harvey discovering the circulation of the blood, but he studied in a North Italian university, because if you want to study medicine, you went to Italy. So, yeah, the Italian universities were very important. I mean, Copernicus is in a different situation again, but I think we shouldn't underrate the degree of intellectual independence which could be enjoyed by many intellectuals, despite the authority of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it after Galileo that pretty much, or at least as I understand it, and you can correct me if this is a wrong understanding, but after the repression of Galileo, that most scientific frontiers shifted north into the Protestant countries where the Catholic Church could not quash innovation.
It does seem to be a lot of yeah, you're right that a lot of innovation seemed to happen. Although whether this was because of church authority, it's hard to know. It's certainly, I think, though, that you need to remember, and I'm sure you've written about this too, that the post-Reformation Catholic Church was much more defensive and inclined to insist upon its authority than perhaps the late medieval church felt it needed to be. So after the Reformation, particularly after the Council of Trent, which was a reaction to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church becomes very heavily centralized and feels a need to defend itself over against these nasty Protestants who are questioning its authority.
That's actually a point that Hans Kung, who you introduced me to, Hans Kung, actually, in one of his books, and when I just did the edit, so I'm editing right now and building my index. And I did the Council of Trent, and Hans Kung, who was, for those who maybe not know him, he's a Swiss priest and he died a couple of years ago, a Swiss priest and theologian, but he was a remarkably intellectually honest Catholic priest who had no trouble calling a spade in the church. And he specifically says at the Council of Trent that they do become not only the defensive, but this is the birth of a highly centralized and authoritarian church that is fighting off one battle after another. You've got the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the secular world. And so the reaction of the church is to become this centralized authoritarian institution in order to fend off these continuing threats that are coming at it, like just one after another.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that we can perhaps anachronistically read back this later highly centralized, authoritarian, defensive Catholic Church, what I think of as Roman Catholicism now, back into the medieval period, where in fact the church was a very different kind of beast, I think, in those days. Not that, I mean, obviously, people could still be tried for heresy and were. Abelard was tried for heresy on a couple of occasions, but survived. So, but nonetheless, there is a degree of centralization and an authoritarian spirit which develops after the Council of Trent, which perhaps was more so than previously.
Well, like one of the things that has really gotten me, like while I'm researching and writing, is the degree to how much things have changed. Like we know celibacy comes in after the first 1,000 years. It's only the last 1,000 years that it's been a thing. The marriage sacrament, was not a sacrament of the church up until about 1200 with the canonists. Again, the canon law. It was the development of canon law that leads to marriage as a sacrament, and marriage, the blood ties, the consanguinity and regulation of marriage, it becomes a sacrament. There was another point I was going to make there too, but it's gone. Everything is so interrelated. Like that's what makes it so fascinating for me. Is like everything is tied to everything else. Like nothing.
Funny. only someone who studies the history of the Catholic Church would say something like, "Well, it's only been in the last 1,000 years that."
Yeah.
Um, but of course, it's true that actually the canonists. I'm very interested in following this up. I'd like to do more work about the development of canon law because I suspect this was a big influence on many. But of course, about that same period, you also get the sort of struggle for the independence of the church from civil authority,
Yep.
the investiture controversy, and so on.
Yep.
So,
It's all
before,
related. And
yeah,
actually,
it is.
so Brundage, who's a professor in University of Kansas, he wrote a book like Law. I can't remember the full. It's like Law, Sex, and Medieval Christian Europe, something like that.
Right, right,
And he specifically talks about it, like out of the Gregorian reforms and the investiture controversy comes the need for canonists and canon law schools, which then leads into marriage ties and consanguinity and landed estates and like independence of the church from these big powerful landed families that they are now controlling through the regulation of marriage and blood ties.
yeah, yeah. It's a very interesting history that, and um, my goodness, Jason, I hope your listeners have a good knowledge of church history. Your listeners will have to read your book to find
I
out
think
more
so.
about the investiture controversy and these
Oh, that's the
things.
idea. I can put links in the. Let me make a note.
That's
I'll put
good.
some links.
No,
Put
this
some
is good.
links in the description. Yeah.
This
Well,
is
that's what
good.
I mean. So so my book is actually chronological. I actually go like
Right,
start from the
right,
beginning and I go right up. There are a couple of sections where items are chronologically out of sequence just because the topic is self-contained, and so
yeah,
I might have to go beyond a certain point and like maybe leap up a couple hundred years just because it's tied to the topic, and then I kind of go back and then go to the next section and kind of come back and go forward again. But
right.
yeah, there's just so much that overlaps, and and I by telling it chronologically, like the Gregorian forms and the investiture controversy and what led to that and what were the impacts that come after and how it's all connected together. So you might remember there's a scholar named James Burke, and he's basically a science historian, and he did like the day the universe changed, the connection series. So and like even my videos, I have a whole series of videos on my channel called Connections, where I'm trying to tie things together. Like a video I did this week. Yeah, I think I did the video this week on John Wycliffe, the English
Oh, yeah, yeah.
uh, the English professor who did the first English Bible, and how his writings were banned in England because he was critical of the church, but they were picked up by Jan Hus and the Bohemians, and the Bohemians become the Moravian Church, and the Moravians meet up with John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So you go from Wycliffe out of England to Wesley and right back to England again.
And
So very much doing like this connections.
just to bring things to a complete circle, one of the ships that brought Scottish settlers to Dunedin, where I live, here in the south of the South Island of New Zealand, in the 19th century was called the John Wycliffe,
Okay.
after John Wycliffe, because these were Scottish Presbyterians who looked to Wycliffe as an important figure. So the name Wycliffe is actually very well known in Dunedin here because of this connection with the ship, bringing the Scottish settlers to New Zealand, who were Scots Presbyterians, who looked to Wycliffe as an important religious reformer. So, yep, there you are.
Yeah.
It all connects.
And it's funny because just quickly, so I'm involved with, James Burke has the Knowledge Web project, which I got involved with. I haven't done anything with them yet, but I've reached out to them and we're in contact. I sent like a graphic of the connections from Wycliffe to Wesley, and then one of the guys in our group chat said, "Oh, by the way, George Custer of the Battle of Little Bighorn was part of the Moravian Church." So all these like
Mm,
little connections, like Custer and Dunedin. So
yeah,
like history is just a web. Like it's just so cool. That's why I
it's
love
a
it.
terrific move. And once you start pulling on the web, then you never know where it's going to take you.
Hey,
No,
I never know
you're
where I'm going
right.
to end up.
Um, but I think also the what we're becoming more aware of is the degree to which the influences which make up what we might think of as European history are not purely European. They extend well beyond the
Oh yeah,
boundaries of Europe. And even when the Jesuit missionaries went to China in the 16th century, 17th century, they were actually enormously impressed by Chinese culture and sent back a lot of information about Chinese culture and about Confucius as they knew him. And this also had an influence on European thinkers. So I think that, the degree of, in the early modern period, of cultural interchange is very, very significant. So Leibniz, the philosopher, was very intrigued by the Chinese script, which he, not quite correctly, thought to be pictographic, that each character, actually was a picture of the thing it spoke about, which is not quite true, I understand. But Leibniz was fascinated by the Chinese language, the philosopher, German philosopher, because he thought maybe this was a model of a universal language for all of humanity, because it would be pictographic rather than tied to a particular set of sounds. Now, he didn't understand the Chinese language very well, but the very fact that an early modern philosopher should be so fascinated by all this Chinese culture, which was only slowly becoming known at that time, is an indication of the degree to which ideas cross boundaries, people become fascinated with each other's cultures.
Well,
I mean,
that was one issue I actually wanted to touch on earlier when we were talking about the Islamic Golden Age, and I'm curious if you're going to do this in your book. Is the Battle of Talis, and I pulled it up in my notes because I couldn't remember the Battle of Talis in 751 between the Tang Chinese and the Abbasid armies in modern day Kyrgyzstan, and so the Tangs were defeated by the Abbasids, and with them were, I think, three Chinese paper makers, and of course the Chinese religiously guard the secret of how to make paper, and it was because the Muslims defeat the Chinese at the Battle of Talis, they learn the secret of paper, and paper leads, like the printing press, leads to the dissemination of knowledge, and that's why the Islamic Golden Age really took off, because now they've got paper and they can make their observations, they can send it from Persia to Andalusia, and vice versa. So I'm not sure if you're going to be covering that at all.
I'm not. It has to be a short book. I've got a strict word limit. Yeah. But look, you're absolutely right. That's a really good point, because we tend to think, and I still find myself falling into this trap of thinking, well, you have the West and you have China, and they only discover each other in the 16th, 17th century. But actually, of course, the Muslim world had been in touch with the Chinese world. And in fact, Eastern Christians had gone into China as well. So there were Nestorian Christians in China, sort of late medieval period. So you've got, it's not true that the sort of the West and the East. You've got the Muslim world, which mediated between the two, was in touch with the Chinese, but also, in fact, I just read recently that there's some record of Chinese astronomers going to some of these famous Muslim observatories in medieval period in Iran. So the Muslim world does provide a kind of, it means that it was never simply East and West, but there was this movement of ideas across the two. Yeah.
And there's no discrete boundary. It's all information flowing back and forth, and new technologies like paper.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there were boundaries. There were religious and linguistic boundaries, but on the other hand, people did an extraordinary job of crossing those at times when it came to exchanges of ideas. So,
and of course, the Muslims took the Arabic numerals, we called Arabic numerals, including zero, from the Indians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in fact, in Arabic they're called Indian numerals. It's we who call them Arabic numerals.
Arabic.
Yeah, so that's and of course when they come into Europe about the time of Fibonacci, when the Arabic numerals come into Europe, it takes a long time for them to become established. But of course they make mathematics so much easier to do. Try doing.
I think it was I've got the note. I think it was the Pope that I'm named, one of the popes I'm named after. Pope Sylvester II, I believe, was the one. He is the one, I believe, who is credited with bringing the Arabic. Yeah, yeah. He's Pope Sylvester II is credited as being one of the people to bring the Indian numerals into
Oh,
Europe.
so reminded me of his date. What are his dates again?
900s ish. Pope
Oh,
Sylvester
right. Was it that
999 to
early?
1003. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's even before the fall of
It
Toledo in
takes
1085. So
it takes a lot longer for them to become established in Europe,
yeah,
but certainly that's interesting. Yeah, but I mean, once those Arabic numerals arrive, or Indian numerals, if you like, um, they do make mathematics much easier than it would have been using Roman numerals. So that's uh, another development also, which helps to lay the groundwork for modern science. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, it's been an hour. I think we've probably covered most of the topics. Any points you
That's
wanted to wrap up with?
no. I
I don't
think
want to keep
that's
you too much longer.
no. That's I think we'll just encourage everyone to read your book when it turns up. Have you got a title for your book?
I call it Sins of the Fathers, and then the subtitle is The Dark Side of the Catholic Church. So
Ah,
it's
dear.
actually being read. I have another prof who's reading it right now. So you've offered to proofread it for me too,
Right.
but
Yeah.
I've got a professor of Roman history, or the
Yeah.
Roman Empire, who's reading it. So like he knows the early years of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Like up to Constantine. So
Yeah.
he's proofing it right now. So when he comes back with his ideas, I'll incorporate and make all his changes,
Yeah.
and then I'll send it
Yeah.
to you. So,
Yeah.
and one of the points he made was, even though I call it sins of the fathers and all of the shit that the Catholic Church has been up to for 2,000 years, I do talk about the Scholastic Mavericks and the contributions
Yeah.
they made. And he's like, your title, and I did think of that myself, is that yeah, the title is a little bit misleading because it's not all negative, right? Like the Catholic Church
Yeah.
has done
Yeah.
obviously some positive stuff. So what
But
I will do is in the introduction, I will say, look, not everything the Catholic Church has done. This is just
yeah.
essentially a survey of all of the shit that they've pulled and how it's all tied together. Like the forgeries of the 400s, 500s, and
Yeah.
600s, and then the forgeries like the donation of Constantine and the pseudo Isidore false decretals, and
Yeah.
how that builds on the earlier forgeries, and how that that mentality leads to the Gregorian reforms and the investiture controversy and all of this. It's all tied back to
Right.
these earlier forgeries where they just made stuff up about their importance. So yeah,
Yeah. Of
that's why I
course,
say it's
I
all
have.
interconnected.
Yeah, I have sort of fond memories of the Catholic Church for all its failings. So, even though I left it,
Yeah.
um,
Well, that's
and
one
of
of the
course,
questions I had about Hans Kuhn. Is like, like, with all his criticism and all his knowledge, how did he stay a Catholic? And that's, you see the same thing with New Testament scholars who know all of the New Testament scholarship about the
yeah,
apocalyptic Jesus, and yet they're still devout Christians. So
I mean, it's a very. There's much about it There's much about the ritual, about the practice, and of course, there's. And just this evening, as we were finishing dinner, we were listening, my wife and I, to Fauré's Requiem, the music by Gabriel Fauré, the French composer, which was a Requiem Mass, which was the prayers of the Latin Mass for the dead set to music. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of music I know. So, despite all the sins of the fathers, I don't dispute that. Um, there's sort of the culture that the Catholic Church also helped to encourage, music and art and so on, is yeah, it's hard to think of European history without it as well. It
yeah.
was
But I
a
mean, we had
important
music and art
piece.
before Christianity, but Christianity just inspired certain types of music and art. But obviously, we had
Yeah,
it before. We'll have
that's
it
true.
after. So
We will,
I mean, yeah,
but
I mean, I love Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. I think it's beautiful. I mean,
yeah,
I don't really
yeah,
care about
exactly.
the meaning behind it, but it's a beautiful piece of music. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, so perhaps you and I will continue not to take slightly different views of the same history that we agree on.
yeah, well, I
But
mean,
that's
it's a
fun.
fascinating history. So I mean,
It's a
I didn't.
fascinating history. It
I mean, I
is.
didn't know where I was going to go. Like when I started writing this, I
Yeah,
didn't know where I was going to end up or what I was going to find. I was just writing a chapter that was trying to bridge classical antiquity and the Renaissance. And then I start finding all of these forgeries after forgery after forgery, which
Yeah, yeah,
influences this, which
yeah.
influences this, and the year, century after century after century. So,
Right. Well, no, no,
so
that's certainly that's certainly true. So I think, yeah, no, that sounds great. Um, and in terms of the book that I'm hoping to have come out late next year with a bit of luck, uh, my hope is that when your listeners hear the phrase Western science in years to come, they'll think, wait a minute, I heard someone saying, is
it's
science
not
really
Western.
Western? It's not really Western, it's something
Yeah.
else. So, yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Great.
it's been very nice
Well,
to
thanks.
talk.
Yeah, you too. I always enjoy our chats. You've been on the AAI podcast with myself and Andy several years ago, and
That's right.
I remember one. It was a very late night. It was early morning for you. It was late night for me, and it was like evening for Andy. And we
Yeah.
had the podcast, and then we stayed up for like another hour or two just offline after the recorded, and we just talked. And Andy was like, "We should be recording the chat. This is much more interesting than the actual podcast." So
Yes, that's often the case, but there we are.
yeah.
Anyway, good. Well, thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate your time, and it was a fascinating discussion. So hopefully, I gave you a couple of ideas to
No, no, you have
explore
indeed.
our book
Yep.
with with
Good.
with your limited word count. So, but
Yep.
yeah,
Absolutely.
okay,
Good.
great. Well, thank you for everybody for watching. I will put a few things in the description, like investiture controversy, the Gregorian form. So if you want to
Yep.
know a little bit more, there'll be links in the description. So I appreciate everybody watching. If you've come the full hour and 6 minutes, I really appreciate, and thank you for tuning in. And we'll see everybody next time. And thank you very much, Greg. And I look forward to our future conversations. Right.
Thank
Take care,
you.
everybody. Bye bye. Thanks for watching. Please check out the other videos on my channel if history is your thing, and see you next time.